The smell of salt and rotting wood, the feel of damp wool against your skin, the sound of oars dipping into black water, synchronized, relentless. Now, add another sound, one that starts as a whisper on the wind, a thread of melody so pure it seems to bypass your ears and plant itself directly in your chest. It promises knowledge. It promises oblivion. It promises a story so beautiful it would be worth dying to hear the ending. This is what every sailor who ever passed the island of the Sirens heard just before they died. The myth is one of the most enduring in Western culture. Beautiful creatures, half bird, half woman, who sang with such irresistible sweetness that men forgot everything, home, family, duty, and steered their ships onto the jagged rocks where the waves finished what the enchantment began. The story is neat. It is a moral fable about temptation. But if you dig into the oldest versions of the tale, into the archaeological record of the islands where the myth was born, and into the psychological mechanisms that make music so dangerous, you find out that the Sirens were never just about lust or desire. They were about something far more specific, far more threatening to the ancient mind, and the one man who survived. His survival was not a victory. It was a deeper kind of surrender. By the 8th century before the Common Era, when the Homeric hymns and the Odyssey were being codified, the Mediterranean was a world held together by sound. Literacy was rare. Memory was a technology. Information was carried in rhythm and rhyme, in the repetition of epic poetry chanted over wine and fire. The singer of tales was not a performer. He was a living library, a data storage device. The Greeks knew with a precision we have lost that melody was a tool for shaping consciousness. It could calm a riot. It could drive a man to murder. In the 4th century before the Common Era, the philosopher Damon of Athens conducted studies that showed certain musical modes, the Dorian, the Phrygian, the Lydian, produced measurable changes in behavior. Plato banned the Lydian mode from his ideal republic because he believed it made men soft, prone to drunkenness and cowardice. These were not metaphors. These were engineering assessments of how rhythm and pitch could bypass the rational mind and program the nervous system directly. The Sirens were the folkloric embodiment of this exact fear. They were not beautiful women with fishtails. That image is a medieval invention, a conflation with mermaids. In the classical Greek vase paintings, the Sirens are birds with the heads of women, their talons sharp, their faces contorted in song. They sit on a field of bones, on an island carpeted with the withered skins of their victims. The Romans, ever practical, would later describe their lair as a mountain of corpses so high it was visible from the deck of an approaching ship. The fear was not of seduction, it was of knowledge. The Sirens, according to the oldest fragments of the epic tradition, knew everything that had happened in the war at Troy. They knew the future. They promised to tell you the entire story of your life, of the world, of the gods, if only you stayed long enough to hear the last note. What man could refuse? What man would choose ignorance over omniscience, safety over the narrative of his own existence? Odysseus, the man who survived, did not sail past the island death. He had his crew plug their ears with beeswax. But he had himself lashed to the mast of his ship, bound so tightly he could not move his head, and he listened. The description in the Odyssey, Book 12, is a masterclass in psychological torture. The Sirens say to him, "Come here, renowned Odysseus, great glory of the Achaeans. Stop your ship and listen to our voices, for no one has ever sailed past this island in his black ship until he has heard the honey-sweet sound from our lips. He who hears us departs a wiser man." They appeal to glory, to intellect, to the very core of his heroic identity. Odysseus screams at his men to release him. He rages, his eyes locked on the shore where he can see their shapes, filled with tears. He wants more than he has ever wanted anything, to join them, to let the rocks take the hull, to dissolve into the story they are telling. Think about that, a man screaming to be released into the very thing that will destroy him, because the promise of total knowledge is more intoxicating than survival. That is the part of the human psyche we do not like to admit exists. If you want to continue walking this line between myth and mind, subscribe. The road ahead gets darker, and the insights older than the Greeks are waiting. And tell me in the comments, if the Sirens offered you the full narrative of your own existence, would you order the ropes tightened or loosened? The crew ignores him. They tighten the ropes. They row harder. They pass. And Odysseus, the survivor, the man who heard the song and lived, is never the same. He spends the rest of the epic weeping, wandering, unable to find peace. The Sirens did not kill him. They poisoned him. They gave him a taste of a knowledge so vast and perfect that the rest of his mundane life, his return to Ithaca, his reunion with Penelope, tasted like ash in comparison. He survived the body to murder the soul. The story was never about resisting temptation. It was about the cost of knowing too much. Now here's the part that changes everything. The Sirens in the mythos had a prophecy that was kept from most mortals. They were bound to their island by a curse. If a mortal ever heard their song and lived, if the spell was broken even once, they would die. The moment Odysseus' ship passed beyond the reach of their voices, the Sirens were condemned. They plummeted from the cliffs into the sea, their bodies turning to foam, their song silenced forever. This detail, tucked into a fragment of the Argonautica by Apollonius of Rhodes, recontextualizes the entire encounter. Odysseus did not escape. He killed them. He was the instrument of their destruction, and he carried the weight of that death, that extinction of something beautiful and terrible, for the rest of his days. But what if the Sirens were not just a myth? What if they were a memory? In the archipelago of the Aegean Sea, around the island of Anthemoessa, where the Sirens were said to live, there are geological formations known to produce acoustic anomalies, rocks that howl when the wind passes through them at the right angle, caves that amplify the sound of waves into a harmonic hum. The Roman geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, recorded that the area around the Sorrentine Peninsula in southern Italy had a temple of the Sirens, and that the cliffs themselves produced a sound that disoriented sailors. He attributed it to natural causes, but he also noted that local fishermen refused to approach the area after sundown. The line between acoustic environment and supernatural agency is thin when you have no theory of sound waves. The phenomenon has a scientific name: infrasound. Sound frequencies below 20 hertz, beyond the range of conscious hearing, but felt in the bones, in the chest cavity, in the primitive parts of the brain that control fight or flight. In 1998, engineer Vic Tandy observed that a laboratory in Coventry, England, was producing a strange sensation of dread among its workers, who reported seeing apparitions. Tandy discovered a slow-speed fan in the ventilation system was generating a standing wave at 19 hertz. Once the fan was turned off, the ghost disappeared. Infrasound at around this frequency vibrates the eyeballs, causing the visual field to distort, and stimulates the amygdala, the brain's fear center, creating a sense of presence, of something unseen watching you. A group of sailors passing through a canyon that acts as a natural infrasound resonator would not think of fans and hertz. They would think of gods. They would think of voices. But the Sirens are not ghosts. They are agents of destruction who use voice as a weapon. And that detail, the voice as weapon, is the key to the deepest layer. In the early 2010s, neuroscientist Robert Zador-Ray at McGill University conducted functional MRI scans of subjects listening to their favorite music. The results showed that the brain's reward system, the nucleus accumbens in the ventral tegmental area, releases dopamine during moments of peak emotional intensity in a piece of music, when a harmony resolves or a melody swells, the same regions that activate in response to food, sex, and cocaine. Your brain does not distinguish between the pleasure of understanding a complex chord progression and the pleasure of consuming a substance that rewires its chemistry. Music is not a cultural invention. It is a hijacking, an evolutionary accident that found its way into the circuits that decide what is worth pursuing and what is mortal danger. The Sirens song, then, is not supernatural. It is a literary model, formulated thousands of years before neuroimaging confirmed it, of the experience of being overwhelmed by a stimulus that your biology cannot resist. The Greeks understood what we are only now proving, that there are sounds that can kill you, not by smashing your eardrums, but by erasing your will. In the 21st century, sonic warfare is not a metaphor. In 2005, the United States military began deploying long-range acoustic devices, or LRADs, as non-lethal crowd control and area denial. These devices emit a narrow beam of high-frequency sound at 150 decibels. At that volume, the sound does not enter the ear. It attacks the vestibular system, causing instant nausea, vertigo, and disorientation. The weaponized voice, ancient and digital, is still the same force. It reaches past your defenses and seizes the machinery of your balance. The Sirens of the Odyssey are not monsters. They are a perfect cipher for the realization that you are not the pilot of your own mind. There are frequencies that can bypass your consent. There are melodies that can make you love something until you die. The one man who heard them and survived did not conquer them. He was remade by them, and the Sirens in that moment of his survival were extinguished. The myth is not about how to resist the call of the beautiful and dangerous. It is about what happens to you when the beautiful and the dangerous decide to open their mouth and tell you exactly who you are. You do not escape. You become the echo of what you heard. Now consider the Sirens in the context of silence. In the medieval monastic tradition, particularly among the desert fathers of Egypt in the 3rd and 4th centuries, Silence was not a passive state. It was an active discipline, a technology for preserving the integrity of the soul. John Cassian, writing in the early 5th century, described how monks who broke their vows of silence would experience a progressive decay. First, the tongue slipped into gossip, then the mind into judgment, and finally the heart into despair. The cell, the monk's solitary dwelling, was not a prison. It was a fortified position against an enemy that entered through the ears. The church understood, in its bones, that the mind could be colonized by sound. What did the ancients have that we have lost? A diagnosis of the threshold. They knew that the problem was not that the sirens were irresistible, but that the threshold of normal hearing was too easily breached. In the 11th century, the Persian physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote in his Canon of Medicine about a condition he called auditory consumption, a state in which the patient's auditory system became hypersensitive to patterns of sound, to the point where the sound of a lute string or a woman singing could cause fever, insomnia, and a wasting away of the flesh. He prescribed silence, isolation, and a diet of cold foods to restore the humoral balance of the brain. The symptom, the disease, and the cure were all framed in the language of sound as a physical substance that could enter the body and change its composition. Now let us return to the island. The island of the Sirens, Anthemoessa, was said to be covered in a meadow of flowers that never bloomed. The flowers were in a permanent state of bud, frozen before they could open. That detail from a scholium on the Odyssey glossed in the 2nd century before the Common Era is the most telling of all. The Sirens' environment was one of arrested development. Nothing was allowed to complete its natural cycle. The flowers could not bloom. The sailors could not leave. The song could not stop. The moment was stretched into eternity, a continuous present of waiting for a resolution that never arrived. The Sirens were not offering a story. They were offering a story that refused to end. That is the deepest terror. Not the temptation, but the suspension. The Roman poet Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, composed in the 1st decade of the Common Era, gave the Sirens an origin story that explains their frozen state. They were once the companions of Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. When Hades abducted Persephone into the underworld, Demeter gave the Sirens wings so they could search for her across the sky and over the sea. But when the Sirens failed to find their lost companion, they were cursed. They were confined to their island, their bodies transformed into birds, their voices left intact and driven to call out eternally for someone, anyone, to hear them. Their song is not a seduction. It is a search party that will never make contact. The sailors who crash onto the rocks are not victims of temptation. They are mistaken for a rescue that never comes. The entire tragedy of the myth is one of misdirected longing. The Sirens are not hungry for flesh. They are hungry for an answer, for a reply. Now consider the Roman version. In the Aeneid, written between 29 and 19 before the Common Era, Virgil's hero Aeneas sails past the Sirens' island, but the island is empty. The song is silent. The bodies have already dissolved into foam. He mentions the island only in passing, a point in the geography of grief. The Sirens belong to an earlier world, a world of raw feeling and unbounded suffering that the Roman order, the empire of law and straight lines, has already suppressed. The silence of the island is a monument to the cost of civilization. Something wild and terrible was extinguished so that Rome could be built. The Odyssey of Homer and the Aeneid of Virgil are separated by roughly 700 years and a fundamental shift in the psychology of power. The Greek hero listens and is undone. The Roman hero sails past the site of the listening and feels nothing but the wind. The difference is the difference between a culture that believed in the integrity of the individual soul and a culture that believed in the supremacy of the collective state. The Sirens were killed twice, once by Odysseus and once by Virgil, who silenced them by refusing to imagine them. But the song does not stay dead. It resurfaces in the 10th century in the Norse sagas. In the Volsunga saga, written down around 1270, the hero Sigurd tastes the blood of the dragon Fafnir, and immediately he can understand the language of birds. The birds tell him of treachery, of a betrayal that will come from his foster father, Regan. The knowledge of the birds is not a gift, it is a burden that dismantles all trust. Sigurd, like Odysseus, becomes a man who knows too much. The difference is that Sigurd receives the knowledge as a positive force, a toxin that enables him to act, to kill, to die. Odysseus receives it as a negative force, a vacuum that empties him of purpose. Two cultures, two adaptations of the same dread, the fear that information will reach you without your consent and rearrange your priorities. Now look at the neuroscience of sleep and the transition between states of consciousness. In 2023, a team at the University of Bern published a study in Nature Communications showing that the brain, during the hypnagogic period, just before sleep, produces a phenomenon called microdreams. brief, narrative-rich fragments that feel infinitely deeper and more meaningful than normal waking thought. During the state, the default mode network and the limbic system synchronize in a way that dissolves the distinction between the self and the environment. The mind becomes permeable. Ideas from outside flood in as revelations. The siren song may well be a folkloric description of the hypnagogic state, a moment when the boundary between you and the song dissolves, and you are left feeling that you have touched a truth so vast it makes ordinary existence irrelevant. Recall the name of Odysseus' island, Ithaca. Rugged, poor, a place of stones and goats. The hero who spent 20 years trying to return home finally arrives, but he cannot rest. He kills the suitors, he reclaims his wife, and then in the prophecy of Tiresias given in the underworld, he must leave again. He must take an oar and walk inland until he meets a people who have never seen the sea, who mistake the oar for a winnowing fan. There he must plant the oar in the ground and sacrifice to Poseidon, and only then will he die in peace, far from the salt and the spray, as an old man entirely out of place. The prophecy means that Odysseus, even after surviving the Sirens, can never again be a man of the sea. The song has made the sea uninhabitable for him. It has turned his world inside out. The final fragment. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, the geographer Pausanias, in his description of Greece, mentions a sanctuary of the Sirens in the city of Corinth, near the Temple of Hera. The sanctuary was said to contain statues of the 3 Sirens, each representing a different form of melodic death. Paisino, the voice that persuades. Aglaophemy, the voice that shines. And Thalciope, the voice that charms. Pilgrims traveled from across the Greek world to see these statues, not to worship, but to be reminded of the cost of beauty. The statues were placed so that the shadows they cast at sunset fell across the altar in the Temple of Hera, a goddess of marriage and fidelity. The arrangement was a deliberate architectural statement. The voice that lures you away from home and the structure of home itself are part of the same landscape. You cannot have one without the other. So when you feel a melody rise inside you, a song you cannot shake, a fragment of harmony that repeats in the hollow of your skull as you fall asleep, ask yourself, is this mine? Or is this a signal from an ancient search party that still has not found what it is looking for? The song you cannot forget, the tune that rises unbidden from the silent dark, may not be your own. It may have been waiting on that island for 3,000 years, looking for a pair of ears that still knows how to hear. The lesson is this: the sirens are not extinct. They have evolved. They no longer sing from cliffs littered with bones. They sing from the algorithm that suggests the next video before you finish the current one, from the streaming platform that cues the episode before you have decided you want it. Every notification is a note in the endless song. Every scroll is a turn of the oar toward the rocks. The warning the Greeks encoded in this myth was never about beautiful women. It was about the architecture of attention. They built the story of the sirens to remind each generation that the mind is not a fortress, it is a door, and some sounds are crafted not to inform you, but to unmake you. The final piece of the archaeological puzzle comes from the sanctuary of the great gods on the island of Samothrace in the northern Aegean. In the 4th century before the Common Era, the cult of the Keberoi offered initiates a ritual called the Mystery of the Sirens. The initiate was led into a dark chamber, blindfolded, and told to listen. A priest, hidden behind a screen, would sing a melody so complex, so beautiful, that the initiate would weep. Then the singing would stop, and the initiate, still blindfolded, was told to describe what they had seen. The priest recorded these visions. The surviving fragments of the records, preserved in the writings of Clement of Alexandria, describe a pattern. The initiates universally saw water, a boat, a figure lashed to a mast. They saw themselves. The sirens, the voice that unmakes, the voice that calls you home to a version of yourself you have never met. The myth does not end. It was never meant to. It is a mirror, polished with the salt air of 3,000 years, and the face you see in it is your own, stretched tight with longing, listening for a sound you know will come. So you sit with that. The song is still playing. It has been playing since before you were born, since before the invention of the alphabet, since before the first city wall rose from the dust of the Fertile Crescent. It plays through the wind in the rigging of a ship that sank 2,000 years ago. It plays through the static between radio stations. It plays through the silence after a loved one stops speaking. The question the myth asks you, the one that cannot be answered, is not whether you will hear it. It is what you will do when the song you were never meant to resist finally demands that you let go of the oars. The Argonautica of Apollonius of Rhodes, composed in the 3rd century before the Common Era, contains one last detail. When Orpheus, the poet whose music could charm stones and rivers, sailed with Jason and the Argonauts past the island of the Sirens, He did not seal his ears. He took out his lyre, the same instrument the sirens were said to play, and he played back to them their own song. He outsung them. The sirens, hearing their own melody, returned to them in a form they did not recognize, faltered. Their harmony broke. And the Argonauts passed safely, not because they resisted, but because they answered the song with the song of their own. The myth offers two paths: the path of Odysseus, who survives by binding himself to a mast and enduring the knowledge that unmans him, and the path of Orpheus, who survives by becoming the singer himself, by taking the terrifying power of the voice and making it his own. Which path is yours? You cannot know until the moment arrives and the melody rises from the dark water. But the myth has already told you what the stakes are. The silence after the song ends is either the silence of extinction, the foam left on the rocks, or the silence of a harp string that has just been struck, still vibrating in the air, waiting for the next hand to find it. The sirens called out for 3,000 years for an answer. They have not stopped. They are calling now through the particular arrangement of words you are reading, through the cadence of a sentence that knows exactly where to pause to make you hold your breath. You are the reply they were waiting for, and what you do next, in the quiet after the screen goes dark, is the only verse that matters.